So I guess, I just want to start with an intro for our viewers because, we're coming up on the 20th anniversary of the US invasion in Iraq. And there's obviously a lot to reflect upon because the conflict resulted in hundreds of thousands of Iraqis dead, millions displaced, geopolitical instability in the Middle East. And although the United States did not suffer as heavy casualties, the war really did seem to undermine the belief that many Americans had in the institutions that govern the United States. So I'm very pleased to, be able to talk with you because you were one of the people who had a front view seat to the events that took place back then. So I guess, I want to start from the very beginning because the first Gulf War ends in 1991. How, and soon afterwards, we see that first the Clinton administration and then especially the Bush administration start pushing the narrative that there are weapons of mass destruction in Iraq and that Saddam Hussein plans to use this against other countries in the region. Where did this lie come from and how was it sold to the American people?
In order to understand the lie, I think we even have to go back just a little bit more. Understand that in the lead up to the Gulf War, we had the Cold War, but we also in the U.S. military, we had the residual headache of Vietnam. There was still a tremendous amount of shame, anger, frustration, not just in the military, but in the nation as a whole, that the pain of Vietnam was not washed away by the so-called victory of the Cold War. And so when we move into the what is now be called the Gulf War, but at the time it was Operation Desert Shield, Desert Storm. This was a moment of American reawakening. In terms of pride. I don't know if a lot of people remember, but I mean, one of the most touching moments of that time was when Whitney Houston sang the Star Spangled Banner at the Super Bowl, and just the feeling amongst everybody who watched that. And I was deployed at the time in the Gulf, and just the feeling of pride that America's back. We stand for something. We are something. We are relevant in the world today. That was a feeling that was real and visceral. And we felt that way because we had been sold this conflict as a battle of good versus evil. And but that conflict was sold to us in a very short span of time, from August of 1990 until January of 1991. We had to transition from Iraq being this uncomfortable ally, but an ally nonetheless, one that we provided weapons and support to in a 8-year war against Iran. And now we have to go to war against Iraq. Why? What is this about? And initially, when the administration of George Herbert Walker Bush tried to sell this conflict, they did so honestly, saying that Iraq's incursion into Kuwait not only gave it control of Kuwait's significant oil resources on top of Iraq's significant oil resources, but put Iraq in a position to threaten the significant oil resources of eastern Saudi Arabia, which would basically give Iraq control of the global oil market. And this was unacceptable. But when this explanation was provided to the American people, there was a tremendous amount of pushback. People saying, no American blood for oil. We're not in support of this concept. And so we had to reshape this. And to do that, we had to focus not on the geopolitical reality, but we had to create a cartoon-like enemy, Saddam Hussein. And remember, this is a man who was our ally in the 1980s, somebody whom Donald Rumsfeld traveled to Baghdad and shook hands with on the instructions of President Ronald Reagan. And so now we have to go to war. And so Saddam has to be turned into evil. And so this whole campaign of, the brutality of the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, the brutality of the Iraqi occupation. There was the daughter of the Kuwaiti ambassador to the United States testifying about babies taken out of their incubators, falsely, by the way. And this led to a moment in October of 1990 when George Herbert Walker Bush, in addressing a fundraising crowd in Dallas, Texas, I believe, said that Saddam Hussein was the Middle East equivalent of Adolf Hitler, and that for his crimes against Kuwait, there would have to be Nuremberg-like retribution. This was a decisive statement because now the United States was at war against evil, war against a man who was now defined as Adolf Hitler, and that the war could not, the goals and objectives of the war could not be satisfied unless they were Nuremberg-like retribution. Well, of course, we fought the war. I fought the war, and we won the war decisively, but Saddam still existed, and that was the problem. Because economic sanctions that had been imposed against Iraq back in August of 1990 were linked to Iraq's withdrawal from Kuwait, and now that Iraq had been forcefully evicted from Kuwait, what do you do about the sanctions? If you lift them, Saddam, the most evil man in the world, Adolf Hitler, who needs Nuremberg-like retribution, will be able to just survive, and Iraq will be welcomed back into the fold of the international community. We needed a new excuse, and that new excuse was weapons of mass destruction. You know, none of these weapons took anybody by surprise. Again, it's hard for people to imagine today, but there was a time when the U.S. military trained every day to fight a war against an enemy that used chemical weapons, biological weapons, nuclear weapons. I was in that military. I trained for that. And this was just something that we accepted. It was the reality of war. Now, we told the Iraqis if they use chemical weapons against us, we'll use nuclear weapons against them. So they didn't use chemical weapons. But we weren't scared. We were prepared. We had our chemical protective equipment. We were prepared to fight in a chemical environment and win in a chemical environment. So the notion that Iraq's weapons of mass destruction programs posed a threat to the world of such a magnitude that we had to get a Security Council resolution to disarm an already defeated nation is not believable. But we built this threat up anyways. We magnified the importance of Iraq's weapons of mass destruction programs to justify a disarmament effort that would be linked to the lifting of economic sanctions. So we extended the sanctions using disarmament as the vehicle, but we never intended to disarm Iraq. This is what people need to understand, and I'm telling you this as somebody who was on the ground at the very start. You know, we inspectors were going into Iraq thinking that we had a job from the highest legal authority in the world to disarm Iraq. But then as we're doing this job, we have Secretary of State James Baker saying in public that even if Iraq complies with its obligation to disarm, sanctions will never be lifted until Saddam Hussein is removed from power. That's what it was all about. It was about removing Saddam Hussein from power.
So chemical weapons was just a pretext. And this, I guess, begs the question, to what extent did people in the US government, both in the Bush and Clinton administrations, to what extent did they really believe this chemical weapons allegations? Was there a sincere belief that Saddam Hussein possessed chemical weapons of mass destruction? Or was this a intentional and cynical lie used to justify the war?
No, let me make it very clear. Saddam Hussein possessed chemical weapons, massive quantities of them. He had used them against the Iranians, and he had them in his stockpile during Operation Desert Storm. That's not a lie. We destroyed them. I hunted them down. We blew them up. You know, and then when Iraq tried to hide them from us, then I led the teams that searched for them. No. People have this misperception that Iraq never had weapons of mass destruction. Iraq was bursting at the seams with weapons of mass destruction, massive chemical weapons programs, an undeclared biological warfare program, an undeclared nuclear weapons program, and long-range ballistic missiles, 100 of which they tried to hide from us. They had these weapons. It's the process of disarmament that was inconvenient. You see, we, the inspectors, took our job seriously. We went into Iraq and we carried out one of the most dangerous, difficult missions ever given to anybody ever. We went into Iraq and we got rid of some of the most dangerous weapons under circumstances that would make most people's hair curl. Understand, the Iraqis did not want to give these weapons up. And when we went in, we weren't armed. All we had was a blue passport that said we're working with the authority of the Security Council, and we were going into locations the Iraqis didn't want us to go into and forcibly tried to prevent us from gaining access to. But we did the job. We got the job done. It's not that the U.S. made up weapons of mass destruction. The U.S. refused to acknowledge that the weapons inspectors actually got the job done.
Because they needed weapons of mass destruction for larger aims, which means what were the particular larger aims in question? Because there's, to this day, a lot of debate what Iraq was about. There are some who say that this was basically a neoconservative crusade to try and spread liberal democracy in the Middle East. Others say that this was about gaining access to Iraqi oil. You know, people say that this was also about potentially flexing US geopolitical muscles. What was the real issue driving the Bush administration's obsession to go to war in Iraq?
Remember, George W. Bush inherited the policies that came from two administrations prior, that of his father, George Herbert Walker Bush, and that of President Bill Clinton. George Herbert Walker Bush's goals were to get rid of a political embarrassment, straight up. This is a man who said that Saddam Hussein was Adolf Hitler, who required Nuremberg-like retribution. Now the war ended and Saddam was still alive. That could not be tolerated. Iraq did not pose a threat to the United States of America. Iraq did not pose a threat to its neighbors. Iraq was a thoroughly defeated nation. I know, I helped defeat them. They didn't have a viable army left. Their economy was in tatters. So what was the purpose of all this? Because Saddam's continued survival was a political embarrassment to a president who likened him to Adolf Hitler. And George H.W. Bush was told by the CIA straight up. Robert Gates, I remember when it happened, said, we expect that if we keep sanctions in place, Saddam Hussein his regime will collapse within 6 months, that he can't survive past the 6-month mark. That meant that the weapons inspectors, when we went in, they didn't care about us accomplishing the job. We were just there as a placeholder to create a political situation that allowed the continuation of sanctions. It was never about disarmament, always about getting rid of Saddam Hussein. The problem is, after 6 months, Saddam was still there. Now what do you do? What's the next step? And then George Herbert Walker Bush lost his bid for re-election, and Bill Clinton comes in. Now, I remember this because I was there. I was at the meeting with Amr Rashid, the Minister of Oil, as he laughed at us and said, soon you inspectors will be done, finished, because a new American administration is coming in, and we're already talking with them about lifting sanctions and normalizing relations. There were back channel communications between the transition team of Bill Clinton and the Iraqi government to do just that. And the Iraqis were saying, we won't have to put up with you inspectors anymore. But how did the establishment and the American community deal with this? They faked an assassination attempt. George Herbert Walker Bush was supposed to visit Kuwait when after he left the presidency, and suddenly there's an assassination attempt against his life. And Bill Clinton is compelled, rather than to lift economic sanctions, to fire cruise missiles at the Iraqi intelligence service headquarters, thereby cementing him to the same policy of sanctions-based regime change. So now, instead of doing a diplomatic end around the sanctions, coming up with the termination of this problem, Bill Clinton was married to the same policies. A regime change policy of getting rid of Saddam Hussein that was based upon the continuation of sanctions because of the weapons inspectors, because of the weapons problem. But now here's the problem that Bill Clinton faced. We were doing our job. We were disarming Iraq, and the US government could not acknowledge this. I myself was in charge of getting rid of the ballistic missiles. I'm the guy who finally came up and said, we got rid of them all. I'm the guy that briefed the director of the CIA and other senior American policy officials that we had accomplished the task. This was not acceptable to them. They couldn't handle the truth, so they manufactured a lie. And at the end of the day, the director of the CIA said, thank you very much for your work, but the number of missiles remaining in Iraq is 12 to 20, and that number will never change no matter what you do, because it can't change, because they need the excuse for the continuation of sanctions. And then to top that, Bill Clinton tried a covert action campaign to get rid of Saddam Hussein. They used my inspection in June and July of 1996. I led a major inspection team into Iraq, focusing on the potential of their weapons of mass destruction programs being protected by Saddam Hussein's bodyguards. The CIA used my team to access these bodyguards in a failed effort to assassinate Saddam Hussein. That was the goal of the Clinton administration, getting rid of Saddam Hussein. And when that failed, Bill Clinton then moved into a larger strategy, and it culminated in 1998 in what's called the Iraq Liberation Act. Under pressure from various political groups in the United States, he signed a law that made it official policy. The policy of the United States is to remove Saddam Hussein from power. End of story. And that's the policy that was inherited by George W. Bush, to remove Saddam Hussein from power, but he made it personal. See, he went back to his father. Remember, Saddam Hussein, that man tried to kill my father. That man tried to kill my father. And now you understand why we went to war against Iraq in 2003.
So it seems like, it started off because they needed a sort of ideological pretext to justify the first Gulf War, which was over oil. But I guess it seems like they did too good of a job, and they became prisoners of their own propaganda. They built up Saddam Hussein as Hitler, which meant that they could no longer compromise with Saddam Hussein under any circumstances. Is that like a fair assessment?
That's a fair assessment under George Herbert Walker Bush. Remember, Bill Clinton was willing to walk away from that, so they manufactured an assassination attempt that locked Bill Clinton into the same policy, because how can you do business with the man who tried to kill an American president? So there's two lies. The first lie is that Saddam is Adolf Hitler. The second lie is that Saddam Hussein tried to kill an American president.
When did you realize that these allegations were a hoax? Because you were, as you said, you were on the ground, you were visiting all of these places that, were most relevant to the investigation about weapons of mass destruction. When did you realize that this whole issue was being used as a political cudgel?
Day one. Day one, we knew that the United States wasn't serious about disarming Iraq, and that all they wanted was to get rid of Saddam Hussein. But here's the problem. You see, we worked for the United Nations Security Council. The United States is a member of the Security Council. So you can't go around telling a member of the Security Council that your policy stinks. Plus, here's the other problem. Iraq had weapons of mass destruction. And so it's all theoretical about what would happen once Iraq was disarmed. First, we had to disarm Iraq. So from 1991 until 1994, we were engaged, 1995, we were engaged in the business of disarming Iraq. And so the notion that the US wasn't going to lift sanctions even if Iraq was disarmed was purely theoretical, because Iraq hadn't been disarmed. It was only after we had fundamentally disarmed Iraq and we were starting to ask the question, what more do you want us to do? We'd accounted for 97% of their weapons of mass destruction. We were monitoring the totality of their industrial infrastructure so they couldn't rebuild these weapons. Anything that's unaccounted for would have aged out, meaning chemical weapons only have a certain shelf life. If they were hiding them, they're no longer viable. Same thing with precursor chemicals and the growth medium for biological weapons. What were we supposed to be looking for? And the answer was, you have to get 100% certainty, which meant that we were in this very, very difficult task of basically trying to prove the negative. And and that's the trap that the United States set, so that the weapons inspectors were involved in a very aggressive system to prove something that, frankly speaking, could not be proved. And because we couldn't prove it, the United States was able to justify the continuation of sanctions, until which time they could get rid of Saddam Hussein.
And if I'm not mistaken, you began raising the alarm, in 1998, perhaps earlier, that these, allegations were not substantiated and that this issue was being used as a political cudgel. How were whistleblowers such as yourself treated, and why weren't you able to get through to the American public, to Congress, and help sort of change the course? Why was it that whistleblowers were shut down?
Well, remember, when I first started speaking out, I wasn't a whistleblower. I was doing what you're supposed to do when you're doing a job. In 1992, I confronted the United States government with the fact that we had more than likely accounted for all of Iraq's missiles. The U.S. government objected. In 1993, I carried out more weapons inspections based upon those objections and confronted the director of the CIA once again with the fact that we had accounted for these missiles. That was rejected. In 1996, I began an inspection process to look for what we called the concealment mechanism, how Iraq could be hiding these weapons from us. And I did that job from 1996 to 1998. It was only after repeated confrontations with the United States government and indeed the governments of the other world about their obstruction of the inspection activities, that I resigned. And even then, I can't be called a whistleblower because a whistleblower goes outside of the system. I testified before the United States Senate. I did everything one is supposed to do to bring this to the attention of the American public, of the American politicians. That's not what a whistleblower is. A whistleblower is somebody who goes straight to the press. It was only after all of this activity failed and that I was attacked by the United States. I don't want to use bad language on your program, but the FBI was turned on me by the CIA in 1996, and they harassed me, threatened me with arrest, harassed my family, nonstop from 1996, 1997, 1998, while I was leading weapons inspection programs in Iraq. And the day I resigned, I was summoned to the CIA's station chief in New York City and asked to take a phone call from the National Security Council staff who were begging me to stay on. They said, if you leave, this will be the end of the inspection regime. You're the credibility that makes this work. You have to stay. And I said, but you have to stop interfering with my work. And they said, well, we can't do that. So I resigned. And as I was leaving the door, the CIA guy who I had known for many years and whom I counted as a friend said, after this, we'll never be able to see each other again. And he said, the FBI is going to, and he used a very crude term, what they were going to do to me. Basically, they were going to ruin my life forever. And he said, if you go through with this, the FBI will ruin your life forever. And I said, well, I have no choice. I mean, this is what a man of honor does. I can't allow myself to be called a United Nations international civil servant carrying out the mandate of the Security Council, all the while working under the table for the United States government to fulfill an objective that has nothing to do with the mandate. I don't do that. I can't do that. So I'm resigning. Yep, the FBI was as good as its word. That night, as I met with my fellow inspectors for a farewell drink at a local bar, the CBS Evening News came on. It was Dan Rather. The FBI had leaked to Dan Rather that I was under investigation for espionage for passing secrets to Israel. Now, since 1994, I'd been engaged in an approved intelligence liaison activity with Israel, approved not only by the United Nations, but by the CIA. And so the notion that I was doing anything wrong or illegal is absurd, but they leaked it to the FBI. The FBI leaked it to Dan Rather. And for the next 3 years, I was being investigated by Mary Jo White of the Southern District of New York. And anybody who understands what that means, she's the number one, at that time, the number one attack dog going after all the national security threats, and she never lost a case. And the penalty for the crimes that I was accused of was the death penalty. So here I was, an American citizen, trying to do the right thing, and the FBI was investigating me for falsified crimes that carried the death penalty, and that investigation went on for 3 years. I mean, I finally won. They finally dropped the charges, but I couldn't get employment during that time. Every opportunity that was provided to me was shut down because the FBI said, he's a spy, he's a criminal, you can't do business with him. And that's been going on nonstop. That's what the FBI does. That's what the US government does to people who have the audacity to try and speak truth to power.
You mentioned how Dan Rather and CBS, directly colluded with people from the intel agencies to besmirch your reputation. How do you explain the fact that the media went along so readily with it? Because you think about Vietnam, and the press was very much an attack dog against the people in power, against the military leadership, against the intel leadership. Why is it that during Iraq, especially during the lead up to Iraq, the US press was so deferential to the Pentagon and the Bush administration and the intel agencies?
I have a couple personal observations on this one. First of all, when I went to college, we were encouraged. I was a history major with a government minor. I was encouraged to subscribe to the New York Times and the Washington Post, the two premier newspapers. And I was told that anything that appeared in these newspapers could be quoted directly as a reliable source. So I was raised believing that the New York Times, the Washington Post, CBS News, back in the day of Walter Cronkite, and then Dan Rather inherited that mantle. NBC News with Tom Brokaw, Peter Jennings of ABC News, that these were big names. These were men of credibility, integrity. And they were backed by a system that was serious about reporting the news, the real news, and nothing but the news. And I had no reason to doubt that until there was an emergency meeting in November of 1997 of the United Nations Special Commission, not the inspection group, but the experts around the world, the esteemed diplomats who supported our work. They were gathered to talk about controversies that had arisen from the inspections I was leading. So I just want to set the stage right. This is about inspections that I led, I planned, I coordinated. And so there wasn't anything about what they were talking about that I wasn't intimately familiar with. In fact, I had traveled around the world prior to these inspections, meeting at the highest levels with the British government, the French government, the German government, the Israeli government, the US government. So there was no hidden agenda. Everybody knew what was going on. So in the middle of this meeting, where they're briefing things that only deal about me and my experience, I see the American representative get up and leave. Next morning, the New York Times front page story is written about what this group is talking about and has nothing to do with what we were talking about. The American representative went out and dictated a story to Barbara Crosette, the New York Times reporter, who wrote the story without any checking, any verification. It was a 100% wrong story designed to spin this very difficult subject in a manner that benefited the United States. And I confronted her about that. And she said, well, are you going to go on the record? I said, no, I don't go on the record, but I want to know why you wrote this. And she said, well, that was my source. I said, but you have to check your sources. This story is 100% wrong. That's when I learned that the reporters of the New York Times, the Washington Post, and all the mainstream medias are addicted to information from the US government. They need this information to get their headline stories. Because if they ever challenge this information, push back, then they'll be cut off and they won't get their above the fold headline stories. And I've seen this over and over and over again as stories are told. I also saw how the CIA, when we were involved at the same time, because of that special commission meeting, it was deemed that the Russians, the French, and the Chinese, together with the Iraqis, were winning the propaganda war, that they were spinning the story of what was going on in Iraq better than the special commission and its British and American allies. So I watched as the CIA brought in a CNN film crew and allowed us to share classified information. Ironically, the same photographs that we shared with CNN are the ones that I had been sharing with the Israelis with permission that I was accused of treason of. But now that we're giving it to CNN so they can make a documentary about our work, so they can spin it to counter the propaganda being put out by the Iraqis, the French, the Russians, and the Chinese, it was okay. The hand-in-glove relationship between CNN, the CIA, and the US government to produce a propaganda film was apparent to all. And this once you realize this, then the wool is taken off your eyes and suddenly everything becomes clear. The collusion, the level of collusion between mainstream media and the US government to shape perception and not tell the truth is the reality of the so-called free press in America today.
Yeah, and one of the people who was central to US foreign policy, especially when it comes to the legislative level, was then Senator Joe Biden, who chaired the Foreign Affairs Committee in the Senate. Now that Biden is president, could you sort of assess his role in pushing forth the Iraq war? And in particular, as I understand, you had a personal experience with then Senator Biden when you tried to speak out and tell the truth. If you could also touch up on that as well.
Certainly. When I resigned from the Special Commission in August of 1998, the event that triggered my resignation was a phone call from then Secretary of State Madeleine Albright to my boss, Richard Butler, the Australian diplomat who headed up the United Nations Special Commission, to terminate an inspection that I was leading. The team was deployed in Iraq. We were ready to carry out this inspection, an inspection that had been coordinated with every major power in the world. But the United States government had deemed that it was not the right time politically for a confrontation with Iraq. So Madeleine Albright called Richard Butler and had my inspection terminated. And that was the straw that broke the camel's back, because this inspection was based upon some very timely, very sensitive information, intelligence information. And if we didn't do the inspection within a specific time period, that information would no longer be viable. It had a shelf life. as most human source information does. And so I resigned. That's the thing that led to my resignation. And so what the U.S. Senate wanted to do is they wanted to hold an unprecedented joint session of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and the Armed Services Committee. For the first time in history, they were going to have a joint session, and they were going to bring me, Madeleine Albright, and Richard Cohen, who was at that time the Secretary of Defense, up, and the three of us would testify about this incident, about what U.S. support to Iraq, etc. Let me just say that Madeleine Albright and Mr. Cohen know me. They know exactly what I knew. They know my role, and they knew that there was nothing they could do that could counter anything I brought to the table, because I was equipped with the whole truth, nothing but the truth. And I was ready to swear, so help me God, before the entire country, that what I was saying was the truth. And if they had tried to contradict me, I would have embarrassed them and humiliated them in public. So they withdrew. And it wasn't just that they withdrew from it, but now the Democrats, under order from the White House, the Senate Democrats, didn't want me to testify. They were going to try and shut down the whole testimony. And that was Joe Biden's job as the head of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And they tried every parliamentary trick known to prevent this hearing from happening. But Trent Lott, who at the time was a Republican, he was the Senate Majority Leader, trumped them. He shut down the Senate, then he reconvened the Senate in an unprecedented parliamentarian move. And then he personally walked me into the Senate floor and sat me down. Now, at that time, I just thought I was sort of politically naive, and I thought it was an honor to be walked in by the Senate Majority Leader. What I didn't realize is that was like waving a red flag to a bull, especially a bull like Joe Biden. Joe Biden saw Trent Lott walk me in there, and he just was frothing at the mouth. And I was warned. They said, he's going to come after you. And he did. We saw what he did. He came after me in an effort to discredit me. But it failed. I mean, at the time, people who watched it, some people thought, wow, he humiliated me. He didn't. I just sat there and took it. But it backfired on him. When the Senate hearing ended, almost every major newspaper in the country condemned Joe Biden for what he had done. And the level of condemnation was so much that Joe Biden had to, in again, unprecedented fashion, because if anybody knows about Joe Biden, he doesn't apologize. He's not that kind of man. But he wrote a letter of apology that had to be published in the Washington Post. And then he invited me to his office. And for 45 minutes, we had a one-on-one in his office where we talked over the issue. And we came to an understanding of what he was about, what I was about. And when it finished, he sent me a personal letter. And on that letter, he thanked me for my work, thanked me for speaking with them. And he said, if you ever want to, if you feel there's an issue that we need to talk about, don't hesitate to talk to me. And if I feel there's something, I'll call to you. And I thought that was good. So fast forward into 2000, and we're talking about the buildup to this conflict. We're getting ready for a presidential election where Iraq is featuring in both Al Gore, the Democratic candidate, and George W. Bush, the Republican candidate. We're talking about the threat posed by Iraq's weapons of mass destruction. And so I sought a meeting with Joe Biden. I said, remember when we talked, you said if I ever wanted to talk to you, let's talk. Well, he wouldn't take my meeting. Instead, he sent his chief of staff. And that chief of staff, when we started the meeting, attacked me, called me a traitor, said that I was betraying my country. I had committed treason in speaking out. And I reminded him that I was a former U.S. Marine, and you put your life at risk when you call me a traitor to my face, and he might want to rescind those words, which he did immediately. He apologized, as he had to. And then we talked about this issue, and he admitted that every piece of information I was bringing forward was accurate, et cetera, but he said it was inconvenient. You see, there was a presidential election, and Joe Biden couldn't get ahead of the Democratic candidate. Joe Biden wouldn't be allowed to tell the truth. And that was the fact. And then in 2002, in the lead up to the war, I again pressured Joe Biden to invite me to a hearing before the American people to talk about the threat posed by Iraq. And Biden ignored me this time. He wouldn't even send his chief of staff. Instead, he held a hearing together with Senator Lugar of Indiana, where they whitewashed the reality. They put forward a falsified claim of a threat posed by Iraq's weapons of mass destruction worthy of a war. And Joe Biden led the charge through the U.S. Senate to push this military confrontation with Iraq. Joe Biden is one of the main reasons why the United States went to war in Iraq. Today, he likes to pretend that he didn't play such an important role, but I'll say it now, and I'll say it to his face, and I'll say it forever. Joe Biden's a liar. He knew the truth. I told him the truth. And he knew that I was accurate. His chief of staff said so. He said so. Joe Biden's a man who allowed thousands of Americans to be sacrificed for his pride, for his arrogance, for his narcissism, because he knew that one day he was going to be president of the United States, and it'd be very difficult for him to explain to the American people why he took a stance that could be claimed to be pro-Saddam. No, Joe, it wasn't a pro-Saddam stance. It was a pro-truth stance. And had you taken it, thousands of Americans would be alive, tens of thousands wouldn't have been maimed, hundreds of thousands of Iraqis would be alive, millions of Iraqis would have their homes, the entire Middle East would not be in disarray, and America wouldn't be on the downward trajectory it is right now while you're the president of the United States.
So let's fast forward to March 20th, 2003. The rockets are starting to hit Iraq. The troops are starting to move in. Can you recall what that day was like for you? What do you remember thinking and feeling as this was starting to unfold?
I mean, I knew that war was inevitable at that point in time. I had been trying so hard to stop this war. I don't think people understand how hard I tried to stop this war. I'm not somebody who's prone to demonstrations, but I participated in a 1,000,000-man march in London in September together with George Galloway to try and get the British government not to support this war. When I found out that George Bush and Tony Blair were meeting in Crawford, Texas, plotting to shape the intelligence to fit, the threat posed by Iraq's weapons of mass destruction, I realized the only way to counter that was to get weapons inspectors back in. So I flew to Iraq and I spoke to the Iraqi parliament. First person in history ever to do that, foreigner. And from that, I got meetings with the senior leadership of Iraq, and I convinced them to allow weapons inspectors to return. I mean, that was a big deal. And the weapons inspectors were allowed back into Iraq. But then the Bush administration undermined them, attacked them, and said basically it doesn't matter what they do until Saddam Hussein's regime changes. We have to hold them to account. So then I reached out to the Iraqi government again, and I wrote up a 6-point peace plan. And I got Saddam Hussein to agree with it. 6 points of peace that, if implemented, would change the nature of the Iraqi regime. It wouldn't change the regime, but as the U.S. White House spokesperson said, it doesn't mean that Saddam has to go. He just has to change the way he governs. So we had the Iraqi government agreeing to 6 points of peace that would change the way they govern. But then I was subjected to, vicious attacks. Weren't based on truth, but they were there. That thing collapsed. I still ran around. I spoke to the Japanese parliament, trying to get them to not support the war. And I was speaking all across the country. In fact, on the eve of the war, I just finished 2 speaking engagements in California, where I addressed crowds of thousands about the false case for war. And I was actually transitioning through Detroit Airport at the time when I saw on CNN the reports that the bombing had started, and I was sick to my stomach. I was, it was just a gut punch that everything I had tried to do, everything that I had dedicated my life to do, was no more. We had gone to war, and I tell people, always ask me, Scott, why do you do it? Why were you doing it? Are you pro-Saddam? No. Are you pro-Iraqi? I'm not anti-Iraqi, but I'm not pro-Iraqi. I'm pro-America. And more importantly, as a former Marine officer, I'm pro-Marine. I love my Marines. And, I take every one of their lives seriously. These are American treasures. I mean, yes, they're in a difficult business. And yes, sometimes you go to war, and yes, sometimes you die. But my goodness, you don't squander your treasure on a cause that's not worthy of the sacrifice you're asking these men and women to undertake. And invading Iraq under false premise wasn't worth the drop of a single Marine. And yet I knew that moment that Marines were going to die. And that sickened me more than you could possibly imagine.
You mentioned the enormous energy that the anti-war movement showed in 2003 and 2004. Personally, I remember from my childhood in Washington, D.C., big crowds, in Washington, D.C., near Capitol Hill and so on and so forth. And I remember how, this sort of populist wave helped bring the Democrats into power in 2006 and helped fuel the rise of Obama. And in 2008, it really seemed as though the anti-war movement was unstoppable. But looking at the situation from 2023, it seems as though the anti-war movement peaked in 2008. And not only were they not able to stop the war in Iraq, but they weren't able to stop the war in Libya and Syria and the current situation in Ukraine. So, what went wrong with the anti-war movement? Why was it able to harness such popularity and such energy, but it wasn't able to really affect the sort of political change it wanted to?
Well, what's interesting is we call it the anti-war movement. There was nothing anti-war about it. Remember, the vast majority of these people whose roots at that time in the early 1990s, many of them could trace their roots, especially people who were a little bit older than me, back to Vietnam, the Vietnam era. Um, but these were voices, with few exceptions, that were largely silent during the decade of the 90s when Bill Clinton slaughtered millions of Iraqis through economic sanctions. I mean, remember the statement made by Madeleine Albright when asked the question about 500,000 Iraqi children dying because of sanctions. She said, that's a price we're willing to pay. Well, Madeleine, you didn't pay the price. The Iraqi children did. The Iraqi mothers did. The Iraqi parents did. The Iraqi nation did. Not you. But where was the anti-war movement then? Largely silent. You had some well-wishers carrying over from the original Gulf War. I give Code Pink a lot of credit. I give Medea Benjamin a lot of credit. I give Betty Williams, former the Nobel Prize winner from Ireland, a lot of credit. But other than that, there was not much until it became George W. Bush's war, and suddenly the Democratic Party is awakened. The Democrats in America, the progressives, are awakened. But what I found out is they weren't anti-war; they were just anti-Bush. That was the problem. You see, when I'd go and talk to them, I'd say, "Hey, why aren't we reaching out to oil companies? Because this war is going to have a devastating impact on big oil. We should be reaching out to oil. We can't talk to them. Why not? Aren't you anti-war? They're big oil. They're on Bush's side." I said, no, they believe in a viable economy that's going to suffer because of big oil. If you know anything about them, they believe in stability. That's the whole thing about the oil business. You want stability, and we're getting ready to unleash instability on one of the most important oil producing regions of the world. We need to reach out to big oil. They wouldn't do it because this wasn't an anti-war movement. It thrived because it created a political problem for George W. Bush, and it opened the door for somebody like Barack Obama to step into the national spotlight and position himself to be president of the United States. But the moment Barack Obama was elected, look what happened. They gave him a Nobel Peace Prize for doing nothing, literally doing nothing. And then the anti-war movement went away, disappeared overnight. Even though Barack Obama, A, continued the Iraq conflict, B, expanded the Afghan conflict, C, participated in the military attack on Libya. Where was the anti-war movement for that? Yemen, Syria, the whole covert war against Syria. Where was the anti-war movement? There is no anti-war movement in America. There's a democratic progressive element that uses the anti-war cause to pursue their political agenda. But when the president of the United States is a Democrat, they are silent. Only when a president becomes a Republican do they suddenly raise their head and start to speak out. This isn't about being anti-war. This is about being pro-Democrat or anti-Republican.
Yeah. And so 20 years have passed since the invasion took place. And I think the $1,000,000 question on everyone's mind, has anyone in Washington learned their lesson? Has anyone in Washington looked at the situation that unfolded in Iraq and said, we should take necessary steps to make sure we don't repeat that mistake again?
No. First of all, you can't get elected to a position of significant power in Washington, D.C. if that's your attitude. You see, in order to get elected, you got to have money. In order to have money, you got to be able to tie into the typical establishment sources of money. And what anybody should have learned about what's going on in Washington, D.C., it's not about doing the right thing. It's about doing that which is right for people making money, about making a certain element of American political and economic society prosper. No one. I mean, look, if it was about human lives, it's not just what we're doing in Iraq. Look what we did in Syria. Look what we did in Libya. Look what we're doing in Yemen. Look what we're doing in Ukraine. I mean, let's not pretend this is about lives, because we're just willing to allow the body count to pile up and pile up and pile up. It's not about lives. It's not about morality. How can you justify the displacement of tens of millions of people globally? In America, I always laugh. People, we have family values. Have we ever thought about the impact that these conflicts have on families, on children? What about the children who don't get to wake up in the morning in a stable household, go to school and have the the foundation of stability that leads to a good education that positions them to get a good job and be productive members of society. What happens when we destroy all that and we force these children to be raised in an environment of chaos where every day they're not only subjected to potential of violent death, but death by disease, death by hunger? There's no family values in America. It disgusts me. And all of our politicians are complicit in this. There's not a single politician out there that cares about humanity, that cares about human beings. They care about the bottom line. They care about power, sustaining power, so long as it continues to enrich the coffers of those who underwrote their elections. And this is a deeply disturbing truth, because America is supposed to stand for so much more. The America that I believe in should stand for so much more. The America I hope we become will stand for so much more. But at the present time, we stand for nothing except making certain people wealthy, regardless of the human cost.
Scott, this really does beg a fundamental question, though, right? If the United States has such a rotten political system that is incapable of reforming itself, of learning from past mistakes, of holding people who mess up accountable, what's to be done? What can be done to take the world's leading superpower at the moment out of such a precarious position for itself and for the world?
It's $1 million question. I mean, first of all, let me make it clear, I'm an American. I love my country. I love the potential of my country. So any solution, there's a lot of people out in the world that say, well, we need to nullify America. Good luck. I won't support that. And I know there's 300 million Americans out there that won't support that either. And regardless of what you think about us, we're pretty strong. We're pretty resilient. We're pretty tough. So you're not going to beat us. You need us to fix ourselves. That's the solution. We have to fix ourselves. I know there's people hoping for a global, economic collapse of the United States economy. That won't go well for the entire world. There's people out there hoping that, some sort of multipolarity chess game can put America into a corner, but you don't put a superpower with nuclear weapons into a corner. Just like we shouldn't try to put Russia in a corner over Ukraine and Crimea and Novorossiya and things of that nature, because Russia has nuclear weapons. You don't push a nuclear power into a corner. You sit down with them, you talk with them, you work with them. That's tough to do when the United States is possessed of so much arrogance that every time you talk with us, we lie. An agreement doesn't matter. It's going to be up to the American people. And there's the ultimate challenge, you see, because we are, by and large, a consumer-driven society. And so long as a plurality of Americans have wrapped themselves in this cocoon of consumer-driven comfort, we're not keen on rocking the boat. You don't rock the boat that keeps you comfortable. America is going to have to suffer. Not because you try to make us suffer. You try that, we'll hit you back. We're going to suffer because of our own failures as a society. And it's happening now. The homeless, the education problems, the infrastructure problems. I mean, collapsing financial system. America is at war with itself. And as the pain accrues and people's cocoon of comforts are shattered and they're forced to confront the horrific reality of what we have become as a nation, then and only then will we find it in ourselves to do the right thing, to reform our nation, because we'll be confronted with the horrific reality that if we fail to reform, then we will perish. And I do believe that survival instinct is a very important thing. And I think the survival instinct of most Americans will kick in and we will reform. The nation that emerges won't look anything like the nation that exists today. It can't, because this nation is fundamentally broke. This nation's sick. This nation's diseased. We have to cure the disease, heal the wounds, and recast ourselves as a nation of one of equals, one that can sit down at a table with the rest of the world and not try to dictate outcomes, but instead talk with people and negotiate outcomes that are mutually beneficial to all, but more importantly, that are beneficial to the American people, not an American political elite.
And I think on that note, that's the perfect note to end our conversation today. I think that perhaps the biggest lesson we can take away from Iraq is that we need an America that belongs to the American people, because that is an America that will be most friendly to the rest of the world, because the American people themselves don't need endless conflict that drain their country of blood and treasure, but they need, trade, commerce, interaction with the rest of the world, because that's what made America great in the first place.
Well, I agree. We need peace and stability. I mean, the double standard we have when we take a look at our hometowns, what we want in our hometowns is stability. We want predictability. We don't want violence. We don't want uncertainty. So why would we project that onto the rest of the global community? We need to treat the world like we want ourselves to be treated here at home.
Thank you so much, Scott. This was so interesting and so informative. And I know that our viewers, our readers will get a lot out of this conversation. So thank you so much for sharing your experience and your time with us.
Thanks for having me.